Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Hannah Zuberi, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. The International Day of Refugees is June 20th, a time to remember all categories of the vulnerable millions of displaced people who need to be remembered more often. What are the government policies that are failing to protect the rights of those over 60 million who've been exiled from their homes? What can we do about that? Well, join us today as we discuss the situation of displaced people, especially statelessness. Our guests today are Eva Richter of the UN NGO Committee on Migration and Michael Nicholson of the Center of Migration Studies, two experts on the situation of displaced people and especially statelessness. Eva Richter and her family escaped Hitler and the Holocaust by fleeing to China, and she grew up there for 13 years. She was evacuated from China by the US Navy in 1948 during the Communist Revolution, traveling to the United States as a stateless person on documents provided by the United Nations International Refugee Organization, and has advocated for the rights of displaced people both as a teacher and as an advocate for the last 12 years at the United Nations. Our other guest is Michael Nicholson, who'll speak on the groundbreaking news report he researched for the Center for Migration Studies, which shows how under-recognized this problem is in the United States. There appears to be approximately 218,000 stateless or potentially stateless people living in the US. This includes many vulnerable communities, including the Rohingya minority of Burma. How can we better address their needs for basic rights? Today's show will be co-hosted by the head of our UN programs in New York, Adam Carroll. Welcome to the show, everyone.
Welcome. Hannah, would you like to read fuller biography, or shall we go into the questions?
I think we can just start the show now.
Great. Eva, it's nice to see you. It would be nicer to see you again in person. I'm used to bumping into you in various meetings at the UN.
Yes.
I appreciate very much your interest in the Rohingya, which is one of the main focus areas of our organization, Justice for All and Burma Task Force Program. And I understand that your own NGO has links to Bangladesh, which I'll be asking about in a little bit. But first, just to ask you a bit about your own biography, because I understand at one point in your life, you yourself were a stateless person. So just going back, you were born in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
What happened?
Well, Hitler came to power, and that caused my parents to find themselves another place to live. They were both doctors, and there was a question of whether they could start a practice in another country without knowing the language, without having the qualifications, the paper qualifications that that country would provide, and so on, or would require. And so they chose China as a place where they could immediately get reciprocity for their licenses, their German licenses to practice, and where they would eventually learn English and start a practice. So we went to China shortly after Hitler came to power, and we stayed there until the Communist Revolution in 1948, the end of 48.
If I could ask you, were there many Jewish or other refugees who left Germany for China?
There were a great many, but later, rather later than my family was leaving. My family left at the end of 1933. Hitler came to power in 1933. They went to Tianjin, which is in the north of China, because there was more opportunity there for foreign doctors to set up a practice. There was a foreign community of approximately 10,000 people, and they were of all nationalities. I went to an international school, well, it was actually an English school, which had 17 different nationalities among its student body. It was a very, very colonial kind of existence. Tinsin was what was known as a treaty port, which meant that it had its own police force, its own municipal council. It was in every way pretty independent. And that was true of certain other areas of the city, which were concessions conceded to different nations. So each nation had its own little enclave with its own laws and its own regulations and so on and so forth. We lived in the British concession. I went to an English school. There were a number of German Jewish refugees, but I'm not quite sure how many. We were a handful, actually. The Great Migration came in 1938 and following through 1939 and even into 1940, even to the beginning of the war, when, depending upon the sources that you look at, 20 to 30,000 German refugees streamed into Shanghai. And in Shanghai, they were interned in a particular area of the city, barricaded in. You know, they could get permits to go out if they had jobs in the rest of the city, but they were pretty well confined to one area. Of course, in 1941, well, let me back up. In 1937, the Japanese streamed over China and took over China with their military occupation. But they left the concessions pretty much alone, except that they erected barriers between the various enclaves so that it became impossible, except with passports and so on, to go from one enclave like the British concession to the next enclave like the French concession or the Italian concession or the German concession or whatever, you know. So that caused problems because in 1938, my family was stripped of citizenship and we didn't have any documents. So that's the story.
Well, that must have been unsettling, at least, because though you had some measure of privilege, perhaps, in this concessions, there was, well, you were losing your legal status, and we're having some difficulty with the image, I'm noticing.
I don't know why, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So as far as it's good that you were able to survive that situation. Now, I'm wondering if Eva is still on the line or if we've lost her because of some technical issue. Hannah?
Yes.
I can't. We don't hear you.
I just brought Mike on, so perhaps we can start the discussion with Mike until Eva is back on.
Well, Mike, I guess we're going to punt here because we'd like to go back to Eva as soon as we can, but just maybe speaking about statelessness in general. Maybe you can jump in terms of the history of statelessness, if possible, and also its impact on communities around the world.
Sure. I mean, statelessness has umpteen different causes. And, you know, stateless people have been in existence since the current state system began. Some of the major causes of statelessness include state succession, meaning the creation of a bunch of new states when one larger state collapses, such as happened in Yugoslavia, for example, when it became Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, etc., and also the breakup of the Soviet Union. That created stateless populations if individuals could not prove citizenship in a specific successor state. Another major cause of statelessness is denationalization or policies, discriminatory policies in which governments strip certain people belonging to certain racial groups or religious groups or other social groups of their nationality, leaving them stateless in many cases. Statelessness can also occur in war and conflict situations, if civil society offices that manage birth registrations close down, and for example, if people become refugees and they cannot return to their country of origin, they might not be able to get documents to prove citizenship, which can cause statelessness or lead to their statelessness in the long run. Statelessness is also caused by policies that are in place in many countries nationwide, worldwide, in which women cannot pass on citizenship to their children. Many countries limit the transmission of citizenship to men and the male line. And in other countries, women have to be married in order for citizenship to pass to their children. So this creates stateless classes in certain countries. A major example being Nepal, in which many people, many children are born without any citizenship, and in some cases they can register, but in other cases it's very difficult to find paperwork or to procure the necessary documentation to claim their citizenship. So many of these children born in countries with these policies end up stateless. And
yes, I'm back finally.
Oh, well, better picture. Good. Well, we were just talking a bit about, just the history of statelessness. And during and after World War II, and of course, after Germany was defeated in the war, there were displaced and stateless people all over Europe.
Yes.
So at some point when the communists came in to China, you and your family were somehow evacuated?
Well, what happened was that we were not classified as displaced people because we had fled Germany in 1933, as I said, my family left. And we were considered to be refugees. This was before the Refugee Convention was created. That was in 1951. By that time, we were here. And so the situation was very, very fluid in 1948 when my mother and I left China. It was not clear what our status was, except that we were stateless. We had no citizenship, having been specifically stripped of citizenship by the Germans in 1938. So, in fact, all German Jews were stripped of citizenship a little bit later than that, I think it was 1940. So we were all stateless, but we were not considered displaced persons. Displaced people were the ones who had stayed in Europe and had been in displaced people's camps. So we came to the United States. The situation in China, of course, was quite chaotic because the Second World War, during which the Japanese had military occupation of China, and their headquarters for North China were in Tianjin, which is where I lived. So we were under military occupation, but it was the American forces that took the surrender from the Japanese in 1945. And we were then under American jurisdiction from that time on, while the Civil War raged. So finally, the U.S. Navy evacuated us from North China because they were the only functioning organization around at the time. And we traveled on documents issued by the International Refugee Organization, which was a precursor at the UN of UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Right? So when we came, there was no refugee convention as such, and our situation was a little bit fluid.
Well, you've seen the whole construction of an international system that at least is supposed
right.
to be protecting refugees and displaced people in the
Yes.
various categories, which reminds me a bit about these categories. There's migrants, there's forced migrants, there's refugees, there's asylees, and so forth, and perhaps even the designations can be politicized for the convenience of various states. But there should be some clarity. Is there any thought you have about all of these displaced categories?
Well, the categories very often overlap, of course. And when you talk about migrants, what's happening today is that we have mixed migration. We have migration flows, which include all of the categories that you named, and people can belong to more than one category at a time. You know, so the laws under which they finally find some refuge in another country are a little bit confusing and overlapping, I must say, which is one of the reasons why at the border there is just so much confusion at any border. To categorize the people who are coming over is certainly not an easy matter.
Well, your own personal experience led to a career in teaching in many places, both in the City University of New York and also in China itself. I guess you grew up speaking Chinese.
I grew up speaking Chinese, but because of the very, very colonial situation in Tianjin, I went to an English school and then to a French school and then to an American school, depending upon the different vicissitudes of the wars and the Civil War and the Revolution and so on. And I ended up not ever having really studied Chinese. In none of the schools was I taught Chinese to read and write. So I have ended up speaking it in a very elementary conversational mode, but not reading and writing.
But you have been teaching for some years, I think, in various Hubei, is that? Yeah.
Hebei Teachers University. I had a sabbatical from the City University of New York, and I was feeling nostalgic, and I wanted to see what had happened to China, and I did not relish going back as a tourist because I felt that would be awkward. So I went back and taught there for a year, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. China had made many, many different strides, but at the same time, they were just coming out of the Cultural Revolution. And it was a very, very difficult time just before Tiananmen Square, a couple of years before that, but with the seeds of change definitely very, very important at that time.
Well, those seeds have had a hard time in the years since. But as far as engaging now, inspired by your own experience, engaging on behalf of migrants everywhere, you have been working at the UN. Your own NGO is named Peace, which is poverty elimination. What is it?
Poverty elimination and community education. Yeah.
And it's based both here and in Bangladesh?
That's correct, in Bangladesh. And in Bangladesh, it is based in Dhaka, but we have a school in Mymensingh, which is about 180 miles or so from Dhaka. And it's a very, very poor rural area. We have a school there which is coeducational, but it definitely goes for the education of women. That is prioritized. It's a school that is a multi-purpose school, so it has grades 1 to 5. And then that follows a training program. It's a training program which trains women to do sewing and dressmaking and so on. It teaches them entrepreneurship. It helps them sell their goods in various places. It teaches them literacy, basic numeracy, etc., etc. And there are also consciousness awakening classes and so on, which include both men and women on the status of women. So it's a school that is just getting off the ground. We have now integrated the second grade, and we plan to integrate an additional grade each year. The COVID virus, unfortunately, has forced closing of the school. So at the moment, like many other places, we're in limbo. Obviously, it is not a wealthy community. On the contrary, it's a very poor community indeed. And while we were planning to teach computer literacy, it's a very, very important part of it, we have not yet been able to arrange that. And most people do not have access to the internet. So distance learning is not an option. And that is a real problem throughout, for everybody who is poor, rural, throughout the world.
Yeah. Well, it's been a frustration that Rohingya are not generally allowed in the public school system in Bangladesh.
Yes.
And also that the access to education in the refugee camps themselves was only just beginning before COVID-19 struck and shut all the schools down. So this is definitely harmful to the rising generation of Rohingya. At the same time, we know that there are many, many Bangladeshi migrants in the world, and they've been impacted by this crisis as well by having to return home. So this is certainly, I did want to ask you about women though, because at the UN, you've served at the executive committees of the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, and also the expert working group for addressing women's human rights in the Global Compacts. So I was wondering how the COVID-19 crisis impacts migrants in general, and also how this might be gender specific.
Well, I think both are a very, very relevant issue indeed. And as we know, migration impacts women in different ways from the ways in which it impacts men, particularly in the work areas, where women are generally relegated to positions of, let's say, lesser status, taking care of children, being domestics and so on. Their pay is obviously generally lower than that of men. They are subject to, practices that are dangerous and difficult. Very often they're forced to give up their documents when they start a job. They don't have the flexibility that a great many men do have in changing jobs and so on. So in general, women are more impacted. Now with the COVID virus, women in general are impacted, as are men, by the way, in ways having to do with the quarantining and the way in which the pandemic has developed. Going home, getting back to their countries is a major, major difficulty. And it is very, very hard for migrants in general to get the documents that they need to travel, to get the permission to go home, they are very often stopped at borders and so on. We have excellent practices throughout the world in many, many countries, but the problems are really overwhelming. I'm happy to say that in New York City, for example, there has been a law passed that all migrants, regardless of status, and that includes the stateless, and it includes the refugees, the migrants, the asylum seekers, the asylees, etc., everybody has the right to free treatment, free testing, free everything that an ordinary citizen would have. And a number of countries have followed suit. Other countries have done various things, like, for example, Portugal has been emptying its refugee camps and so on, and trying to find safe haven and safe housing for the refugees that it had been holding in these camps. And a number of countries have followed suit. And the New York State Department of Health announced that all low-income immigrants, regardless of status, would have access to testing, evaluation, and treatment. Whether that is always followed or not is another matter. But these are the concerns, the health concerns, the quarantining concerns, the questions of travel and communication with the home country, and of course for stateless people who have no consular officials and no consuls who could help them in the situation, it is all very much more dire.
Well, in a moment, I'm going to bring on Michael to talk a bit more about stateless people in the US and how they're impacted both by policy and the current pandemic. But I did want to ask just a little bit more about your NGO Committee on Migration,
Yes.
what you're currently working on, and if that has changed at all in the last few years.
Well, we have been working on many different cross-cutting issues having to do with migrants. I've been, as you said, very concerned with the position of women migrants, but the committee at large is part of a so-called action committee, a civil society action committee, which is a network of NGOs across the world. There are about 4,000 of them. And they range from very small religious communities to very large organizations. Well, there are many of them. I'm happy to say that CMS is one of them. And we are very active in that group, in that network, with the Global Forum on Migration and Development. And we have been very much involved in all of the forums since the very beginning, in creating them, in following what they're doing, in integrating their particular findings into programs for migrants. We've been publishing statements and position papers that have been used in the conduct of various in various places in the UN, not only with the Global Forum, but of course with the UN Network on Migration, which we were consulting in creating as well, with the whole development of the structures in 2018, from 2016 to through 2018, through the Global Compact on Migration and the new Global Compact on Refugees and so on. We have been very instrumental in bringing in the voice of civil society to those documents. And I'm happy to say that for a long time there, the UN was really focused on the issue of migration and did make quite great strides in what was happening.
I think maybe many people are not aware of all the many behind the scenes efforts, and sometimes successful in changing legal norms, in changing state policies, and sometimes not. But I think people are very gloomy because of certain aspects of the UN being dysfunctional. But at the same time, there are many very important activities. You mentioned the 4,000 NGOs that were linked in this movement, really, to reform policies and protect migrants. I would like to, since we're talking about policy, I'd like to bring on Michael Nicholson from Center for Migration Studies, maybe to speak a bit about US policies. Eva and I were both at the launch of your report in January before we were all locked away. And it was really eye-opening. to learn that there are 218,000 stateless or potentially stateless people in United States, more or less, and that up to now there really has been no documentation of this community, of this vulnerable community. Why is that? Why was it so lacking? And maybe if you could speak a bit about how you came to work on this project.
Certainly. So we do not, in the US, there are very few sources of data that focus on stateless persons. In many other countries, there are population registries or demographic surveys that through which stateless people can be identified, although it's a challenge. Broadly speaking, globally as well, to identify stateless persons. But in the US, administrative data structures or data systems do not typically identify stateless persons. So reports that have been previously written have been cobbled together from mostly enforcement data, data on persons who have been stateless persons that have been detained or who have been under deportation orders. However, these reports fail to capture many stateless individuals that have not encountered the U.S. immigration enforcement system. Also, many stateless persons in the United States are refugees as well, such as the Rohingya, that have not yet obtained U.S. citizenship, but do not possess citizenship in their country of origin either. So our goal in this report was to provide a broader estimate of potentially stateless and persons potentially at risk of statelessness using, by mining Census Bureau data, something called the American Community Survey, which is a large representative survey of, in our case, we used 5 years of pooled data. So this is a sample of 15 million individuals, 15 to 16 million across the US that are weighted up to population totals. So we mined that survey using profiles of potentially stateless and potentially at risk of statelessness persons that we flagged upon consulting experts in statelessness from the United Nations, academia, several statelessness research centers. So we basically mined this data and flagged individuals that could be potentially stateless or potentially at risk of statelessness. So this 218,000 number should represent an upper bound on the number of individuals that might be stateless in the U.S. Although we do not have the capacity to interview individuals and ascertain whether or not they are in fact stateless. But we believe that this is that there are large communities of stateless persons in the U.S. And many of these are legal refugees or refugees that entered the U.S. Through the refugee resettlement program. But there are also individuals that are currently undocumented that are stateless as well.
Right. So many of these communities, whether they're Palestinians or Kurds or Sahrawis from the Western Sahara or Rohingya and so forth, and I think you have done some interviews with some as part of this. They've been traumatized by having all their rights and their identity taken away. Mm-hmm. You mentioned in your report that there's quite large populations probably in California and New York and Texas, mm-hmm. Ohio, and then Minnesota and Illinois, but really in all 50 states. And so, what are their needs? Until this number was come up and this report came out, there was no pressure for the U.S. government to create a policy to protect stateless people or to recognize their needs. And so, we are all very aware of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that surrounds us in the United States as well as elsewhere in the world. And so it seems to be quite helpful now to get a sense that there is this other vulnerable subgroup within the immigrant community here in the U.S. So as far as working to study this group, how did you gain trust, and what kind of specific challenges did you find that stateless people face, especially under the current administration?
Yeah, I mean, gaining trust was quite difficult. I mean, and also not only gaining trust, but getting NGOs, for example, that we contacted, a lot of them didn't believe that there are stateless people in the US or have never heard of stateless people. So actually, because a lot of stateless people feel very stigmatized and have experienced trauma on account of their statelessness, or trauma that led to their statelessness, it's very difficult for many of them to open up. And so it was very challenging. We conducted 48 interviews with stateless individuals in several different locations across the US, and that included about 24 Rohingya in Chicago. But yes, I mean, in many cases, some individuals might not understand their citizenship status themselves or know that they're stateless, because policies can change in the blink of an eye that render people stateless. For example, in Mauritania, which is a West African country, there was a census that occurred in several years back that was used to determine citizenship, essentially. And Black Mauritanians living abroad were not counted into the census, and therefore had trouble actually proving their citizenship. And they've when they've needed to either renew their passports, or if the US government has tried to deport some of these individuals back to Mauritania, they cannot prove Mauritanian nationality because Mauritania will not recognize them, given that they did not participate in the census. And it is many of these individuals did not even realize that they could not get citizenship, or that their Mauritanian citizenship was no longer valid until they actually tried to get a new passport. So I mean, it's a combination of people not being aware necessarily of their status, people not believing that stateless persons exist, and then stateless people face stigma and fear about talking about their own status. And that has also, you mentioned how current policies are affecting stateless persons. I mean, it really depends on whether we're talking about individuals such as the Rohingya and many Nepali Bhutanese that were admitted to the US as refugees and have not yet naturalized as US citizens. So many of them do not currently have a passport from any country. So what that means effectively is that they could remain stateless if they are not able to pass the naturalization test and meet citizenship requirements in the US. And that could mean that if the government were to crack down further, they most of them are lawful permanent residents, but they are still liable for deportation as long as they're not citizens of the US. So they're always at risk until they get a US passport. And there are significant barriers to that because many of these populations have low levels of education and literacy, and the fees for applying for naturalization keep getting steeper and steeper. In fact, the Trump administration has proposed another fee hike, which, it's over $700, and many of these new refugees can't afford it. So, without a US passport, also many of these refugees face difficulties traveling abroad to visit family members, etc., because, even if they have refugee travel documents, they're often detained in airports, or they might have trouble they might have trouble getting visas to certain countries that don't recognize refugee travel documents. So for those who are in the US and are undocumented and stateless, that's an entirely different can of worms as well, because and this in many cases refers to individuals who came legally to the US Many of them were from the former Soviet Union or former Yugoslavia. And when these countries collapsed, they were still in the US for whatever reason, and then they could not claim citizenship in the country, in a former Soviet successor country. So what effectively happened to many of these individuals is they ended up in the United States, unable to claim asylum because they are not a member necessarily of a persecuted group. They do not have a path to permanent lawful residency or lawful permanent residency or citizenship. And they do not have access to a passport from their home countries. So many of them were forced to stay in the US undocumented, where they face, if under the Trump administration has been eliminated the priority system for deportation under Obama. So many of these communities have been at higher risk of deportation and arrest. And many individuals have been arrested for multiple times. They can't be deported in many cases because no country will take them. So that means multiple arrests, often in detention for months at a time. Those that are under orders of supervision, meaning they've been released from detention, can get work authorization, but it can be difficult to renew or it can lapse. And that effectively means that they go long periods without being able to work. They might have trouble getting driver's licenses. So, and for now, there's basically no path forward for these individuals. There's no path to citizenship. They live in a legal limbo, which creates a lot of difficulties for them psychologically, as well as these problems that I've mentioned.
I was going to mention that you started your report with two very resonant quotes. I'm going to read them. One is, "I question my very existence, my very essence of being human. We don't want to live or die as ghosts." Mm-hmm. And that's from a stateless person from the former Soviet Union. And the other quote is, "Stateless means having no hope, being kind of empty, because sometimes your body is moving, but there is nothing to tell about yourself." And that's a stateless person from Ethiopia. So there's much more widespread trauma than we realize, and it really calls for some attention. Now, I wanted to invite Eva back, former stateless person, and now very active on behalf of migrants. If perhaps someone could add her back on camera, that would be great. Just to look briefly in the last maybe 7 minutes we have on US and also international policies. I understand the US has not signed some of these agreements that protect immigrants. I think, is it the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees? Yes. The US hasn't ratified the 1954 convention. Maybe you could correct.
Yeah, the 1954 convention on statelessness and the 1961 convention. So,
yeah, I mean, our policies, do they change as according to state, or New York or California or Alabama, or how is it go?
With respect to statelessness, there really is no policy anywhere, and I think that that's a lot of the problem is that stateless people aren't recognized. I mean, this quote is quite powerful in that, people don't want to die as ghosts, and I think that's a lot of the problem that people are facing, and a lot of the challenge that stateless people face is to raise awareness that they are a population. They exist, and that's what we tried to do in our report as well, is show that these persons do exist, and we're hoping that that the government creates a path to lawful permanent residency for them, that their temporary ID cards, that is something that some states have, right? Like ID cards given to all residents that allows them to partake of certain local benefits, such as the ID NYC in New York City, that allows people to access, public health in New York City, for example. So there are some benefits, but that are local, but they're not targeting stateless persons directly. So the more entities that recognize this, the better off stateless people will be, and also judges need training, immigration lawyers need training, to learn more about stateless people and their plight.
Well, this is certainly true. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I just wanted to mention that you're absolutely right. Being stateless is being statelessness, and that is the problem. That people don't even very often have the basic documents that will prove their existence, like birth certificates, for example, like school certificates, and so on and so forth. And so they are really, literally non-persons. And trying to get some kind of identity established is a really, really difficult matter for a stateless person. And you have to have that basic identity before you can go to school, before you can get some kind of certification, etc.,
I wanted to mention one other thing that I forgot to mention before, which is the lowering of the refugee cap to 18,000 for fiscal year 2020 on the part of the Trump administration also creates barriers to other stateless refugees, such as the Rohingya, to come to the United States to seek relief. And for the Rohingya that are already here and other stateless refugees that are already here, it blocks their ability to bring family members to the United States as well. So that's a problem that many Rohingya, especially from our interviews, are facing. They have many family members scattered across the world that they cannot bring to the United States in the near future due to the Trump administration's strict caps on refugee admissions.
Well, recently, of course, the United States has not participated in anything having to do with migrants. They were not even in the room during the discussions that led up to the development of the new global compact on migrants and the new global compact on refugees. They refused even to be at the table there.
It's very unfortunate the unhelpful role that the U.S. has played in this huge issue with 60 million or more displaced people.
Yeah.
We're going to have to wind up in just a moment, but it's been an interesting discussion and an important one. Even the Trump administration's attack on birthright citizenship, which they depict as anchor babies, but it means that if you were born in the U.S., you have the right to citizenship. It's a basic thing, and it's a usual norm. But unfortunately, in other countries, it's lacking as well. And so we may end up with a worse crisis because we're changing the laws to be harsher and more restrictive. So this is something to fight against, to struggle against, and in partnership with the impacted communities, learning from each other, learning from our experience, Eva, your experience as well. And hopefully we can keep going during this pandemic. I did want to ask Mike just briefly a little bit more about Center for Migration Studies, because you're very active, and I see that there's a lot of work you're doing at the center on the impact of COVID-19 on migrants.
Yeah, so we are an independent think tank and educational institute that's dedicated to the study of international migration and research that aims to support policies that better the lives of the most vulnerable populations, such as refugees, stateless persons, undocumented persons, etc. So we publish a lot of research. We're working on some work on the refugee resettlement system. We've published a lot on DACA. And recently we've been doing a lot of work on COVID-19, as Adam suggested, or as Adam mentioned, in particular, highlighting that many immigrants are essential workers, many undocumented immigrants are essential workers. They are, basically keeping our economy and our lives going during this pandemic. And many of these people who, are at high risk of they're out, working every day, commuting on public transit, et cetera. They're putting their livelihoods at stake, and they don't have any path to citizenship or lawful permanent residency in many cases. So our page highlights that. We have estimates of essential workers, of foreign-born essential workers. We also have some accounts from on some written accounts of populations that were not eligible for relief under the CARES Act. We have accounts about how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected Venezuelan refugees, as well as some research on specific communities that have been impacted by COVID. So if you check our website, many of these, we're constantly updating and adding new material, of relating telling the story of the pandemic as it relates to vulnerable immigrants and refugees.
Yeah, well, thank you. And we just have 1 minute left. Yes, Eva?
Can I just say something about the UN, because you were talking about the fact that a great many people are rather disappointed in what the UN is doing. There has been a move under the Secretary General to go from policy to implementation. And I think that is a pivot that is extremely important. They are trying now to work. They're basically saying, we have all the policies that we need, we have all the instruments that we need, all the ideas and all the ideals. Now we really have to implement them. And the place that we have to implement them is on the national level and on the level of the ground in the various communities. And that is one of the most important things. That is why I'm absolutely delighted that New York City has been so groundbreaking and forward-looking in its policies. And it's very, very much on top of the whole issue, way ahead of what the government is officially doing. And I think that's true in many locations. So we have to work on the ground. We have to work individually. We have to work even if our own governments have abandoned the fight.
Right, political will, but also people power. So hopefully there's hope for that. Absolutely. So again, thank you all very much for joining us on Justice for All's Justice for All Now program. And again, thank you, everyone. I hope to stay tuned.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thanks. And hopefully, SETA will